as our nation rips itself apart. How much of it is justified? How much of it is judgment? By now, most people, unless you've been living under a rock, are familiar with the name George Floyd. 46-year-old black man residing in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was an unemployed security guard. He had lost his job over the COVID-19 shutdowns. He was accused as having passed a counterfeit $20 bill at an area deli. Police apprehending him claim that he resisted arrest. Camera footage shows no such resistance. The police claim in the arrest report that he refused to get into the patrol car and that he threw himself to the ground, saying that he would not go. People who were there filming with their smartphones, their iPhones, didn't hear that. What they did hear was, "You're on my neck. I can't breathe. Please don't kill me. Mama." For 8 minutes, 46 seconds, the police officer kept his knee into the neck-throat area of George Floyd. If you've watched the video, it should anger you. If you've watched the video and it doesn't anger you, there's something wrong with you. And yes, there needs to be justice. The police officer who committed this atrocity has been arrested. He will be charged with murder. Now, obviously, there will be nuancing over the charges. Some would like him charged with first-degree murder, and I have to be honest, I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is for it to be first-degree murder, it has to be murder with intent, premeditated, planned murder. We have gotten to the point where protests have become riots. Now, is that protesting which has just simply gotten out of hand? Or are there other outside forces that have stepped in and stirred and agitated the waters and created this environment? And I think we'd have to be absolutely naive to deny that's happening, despite the fact that the mainstream lying legacy corporate corrupt media is doing everything they can not to report that. Although mayors and police chiefs and municipal leaders are pretty out there by saying, look, 70, 80% of the arrests that we are making are from people who don't even reside in our city. I can tell you that in Toledo, Ohio, a protest became extremely violent. They tried to actually burn down the shopping mall. No, they didn't just try to break in and loot. They tried to burn down the entire mall. Several local municipality police departments worked with the Toledo police. Lots of arrests were made. Most of the people arrested were from Detroit. It's an hour away from Toledo. So we do know that there are outside groups coming in. There are infiltrators. So the first thing we have to do is we have to be abundantly clear that we are for George Floyd and his family. That we are outraged at the brutality. And I wrote this on my personal Facebook page. That if you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, then you know racism is a sin. Police brutality is wrong. Murder is a crime, even if you're wearing a uniform while doing it. But I also wrote, if you have a relationship with Christ and His Spirit indwelling you, then you also know that stealing, violence, looting, destroying property, and criminal behavior is wrong, a crime, and sin. We have a sin problem in our country, not merely a skin problem. I want you to think about this in another light, because you're getting all kinds of analysis about Antifa is involved. The president has now declared Antifa a terrorist organization. And he's gearing up to use real military, not just SWAT, not just National Guard, but the actual United States military. It's obvious from video footage when you're watching people just rampage and ransack a Target or a Nike store, and they're laughing, they're drinking, they're partying, they're carrying out as many sneakers as they can possibly carry, and TV sets and home electronics, and then burning the place to the ground. That is not about George Floyd. That is not about injustice. And even some of you well-meaning individuals misquoting and misrepresenting the quote of Martin Luther King, who said that rioting is the voice of the unheard. That was not Martin Luther King in any way condoning violence. In fact, Martin Luther King was completely committed to nonviolence. In fact, in one of the very last speeches he ever gave, he said, "I am so committed to nonviolence that if every other voice in the civil rights movement disagrees with me and calls for the black population to unite en masse and become violent, I will be the one lone voice standing by myself saying, don't do it." Martin Luther King changed the world. Now, I understand there's a generation today, they're fired up, they perceive and see injustices, and they want something done about it. But they're also given to some revisionist history where they think that, Martin Luther King, that everything he did was in vain and nothing is improved. And that's a lie. We've had a black president. We've had black governors and city mayors and black police chiefs and black fire chiefs and black congressional leaders. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Now, that does not mean that there are not still problems and injustices, but let's be honest, the media will take an issue or two and just magnify it to convince people this is always this way. And this is tragic. And there are those using it for their own purposes. It is amazing, and I say this as a side note, that all of a sudden, we're not talking about coronavirus anymore. The media isn't talking about social distancing and the spread of COVID. We're talking about this. It's amazing how quick the media, when they choose to switch up the narrative. And yes, there are all types of scenes and even memes out there now of hundreds and if not thousands of people in the streets and things like, hey, where's their mask? Hey, why aren't they social distancing? And that is not in any way meant to make light of what happened to George Floyd. And I realize it. Comments like that can take away from the injustice that was done to George Floyd. But what else takes away from the injustice done to George Floyd is the fact that there are people with a political agenda hijacking his death, his murder, for their own political purposes. To create a civil unrest in our nation so that people blame the president. The president last night had to be deployed to the bunker underneath the White House. That's how violent it got just outside the gates of the White House. And I think I read, 50 or 80 Secret Service members were injured last night. Now, I have to say this. What would you have the president have done up to this point? As soon as the video became public of what this police officer in Minneapolis did, the president came down immediately and condemned it, called the police officer a murderer, and demanded that the Attorney General launch an investigation immediately into what happened and why the other officer standing there did nothing to stop it, said nothing. What should the president have done in that moment? Mayors allowed people to take to the streets under the idea that they would peaceably protest. Agitators and instigators have sought to use this to stir things up. Some just to simply loot, rob, and pillage. Others to create fear and convince you this is the president's fault and this is just racism run amok under Trump. Well, may I remind you that we had several incidents just like this under Barack Obama. Was that his fault? But I want to say something here that you're not going to hear anywhere else. Is this judgment? Because over the weekend, we had one of the bloodiest weekends in American history in a long time. It takes us back to the summer of 1968. It is amazing how history repeats itself, isn't it? Anybody understand what the summers of 68 and 69 represent? Not only the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, the Watts riots, the rioting outside the Democratic National Convention. We were watching civil rights marches and police brutality on the TV screens on a nightly basis. There was also a flu pandemic. That's right. There were no quarantines at that time. We even still had Woodstock in 1969, but there was a pandemic. There was a raging, out-of-control flu virus that was incredibly fatal. And here we are, 50 years later, and it's like a replay of 1968, 1969 all over again. But I ask this question, is this judgment? Because we had a horribly bloody weekend, and it looks like the week is going to pretty much mirror what we saw over the weekend. Well, something else happened this weekend that I talked about. Nobody else brought it up. I talked about it on my YouTube channel. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that basically churches are non-essential, and that governors have the authority to override the First Amendment and place all kinds of restrictions on churches assembling and worshiping, etc. John Roberts voted with the liberals again. So much for you never-Trumpers claiming that the reason you can't support Donald Trump is he's a phony conservative. But yet, he has given us two incredible conservative Supreme Court justices. Where did Roberts come from? Oh yeah, George W., the moderate. Like his moderate daddy, his CIA daddy, who gave us absolute libloons on the bench. And I said it before, I'll say it again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't going to live another 4 years. There's going to be another Supreme Court justice pick coming up. It's why it's vitally important who becomes the next president. And it isn't just even about Republican versus Democrat. Joe Biden has provable dementia, cognitive, functional problems. There will be a team of people that you didn't elect, that you might not even know who all of their names are, that will actually be running the government. People you don't know, people you've never vetted, you have no idea what their radical ideology is. They will pick the next Supreme Court justice if Joe Biden gets elected. So the Supreme Court, in all of their unelected glory, determines Yes, governors have the authority to shut down churches and place all types of draconian restrictions on them. So could the bloodiness of this weekend, could that be literally a judgment from God saying, fine, you don't want me in your society. You've kicked me out of your classroom. You've kicked me out of your community. You've kicked me out of your culture. You've kicked me out of your conscience. Let me show you the results of you and your ideas and your policies and what you want to do and how you think everything ought to be done. Let me show you what that looks like. This is awful. It's tragic. The president a week ago said, we need more people praying right now, not less people. I think he's been proven right yet again. Wouldn't you say so? Think about it. When we had things like prayer and Bible reading in our nation's public schools, did we have the pregnancy abortion issues that we have now? Did we have kids walking into schools and shooting them up? Did we have the out-of-control drug problems that we have now? Did we have the violence like we have now? We are a nation in decline and spiraling downward, morally, ethically. And so my heart breaks for George Floyd's family and for people that have to live now in literal war zones in the United States. But unfortunately, this is the ultimate result of the depravity of a fallen man. This is what America looks like without God. You like it? Feel safe? Want to raise your kids in that kind of neighborhood? And I could sit here and I can make the arguments about why would you burn down a Target department store in your neighborhood and then say something ridiculous to defend it like, well, these giant corporations, I'm not going to shed one tear for them. They didn't shed one tear for George Floyd. Okay, you understand that these stores service your neighborhood, your community. They employed your friends, your brothers and sisters. You think when this is over, Target's going to jump up and down to come back and rebuild a store? Certainly not. And then a year from now, we will hear from some black leaders who love to take the plight of their people and somehow pimp it out for their own personal profit and gain. It gets them elected, and then they just bilk and financially rape the people that they claim Whitey's doing it to them. And some of these so-called black leaders will come out and say things like, we need businesses to invest in the inner city, and they just won't. They're creating this poverty. Well, why would you go into an area and invest millions of dollars in buildings and infrastructure only to see it go up in flames the next time an agitation group shows up to take an injustice to an incredible level of violence, vitriol, and communistic anarchy? You know, it's amazing. Some former members of the Obama administration have said this is textbook right out of the Russian playbook. And of course, you know, conservative media, now they even think this is a Russian collusion. Well, we are seeing absolute communistic anarchy in the streets right now. Don't think that Vladimir Putin isn't sitting somewhere in an office in the Kremlin saying, we couldn't have planned this any better if we had done it ourselves. Can you imagine what Communist China is doing with the video footage of our burning cities right now? Can you imagine what the state-run media in China looks like in its portrayal of the United States? Can you understand that many of our allies around the world are decidedly nervous and scared and wondering, are we going to fall? Do you understand that individuals like George Soros and even There are ilk within the Democratic Party are hoping that happens, all because they hate one man, Donald John Trump. They are willing to turn your neighborhoods into war zones. They are willing to see even members of your own minority community made sacrificial lambs, killed and or beaten and arrested, just to get rid of one guy, because they couldn't put up a competent, functional, rational other candidate to choose. Their anti-Trump derangement syndrome, it's off the charts. And it's fueling this. Not one Democratic leader has come out and condemned the rioting. No, instead we misquote Martin Luther King. And I'm telling you, from a pastoral standpoint, I look at this and I say, Judgment Day has arrived. God has said, that's enough. Especially when the Supreme Court basically came out and said, it's not, church isn't needed, church isn't necessary. I'm going to go theological here just for a moment. The book of Revelation, a teaching and outline of end-time prophecy. Some of you refer to it as the apocalypse. And I've used this illustration for several years when in teaching from that book and teaching on the subject of the tribulation. So if you've ever been to places in big cities, large cities, where the neighborhoods are literally burned out and the houses are all empty and boarded up and overrun with drugs and street prostitution and just dirt and filth and nasty, and it's obvious that the city garbage doesn't come in there and haul trash away. It's just an infestation of crime and just wretched conditions. I said, imagine the whole country looking like that, the whole world looking like that, which is what it will look like when the church is gone. Boy, aren't we seeing it right now? This is what America looks like when the church is in lockdown. This is what America looks like when the church is in quarantine. This is what America looks like when the church is under house arrest. This is tragic. This is heartbreaking. And what we have to do right now is make sure that, number one, and we can't get on this holier-than-thou attitude and lump everybody all in one big pile. There was an injustice, a murder done to a man. And even if he was guilty of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, even if he had done this so-called crime, that's not punishable by death. 8 minutes, you put your knee into the neck and throat of a man, and you think he's lying when he says he can't breathe? This was awful. This was preventable. This was corruption. And I don't know if these cops were necessarily racist or just on a power trip or both. But we have to get off our holier-than-thou horse and not acknowledge there are corrupt cops. There are. And this was awful. But we need to separate that type of protest and the Bible does talk about righteous indignation. In other words, not all anger is sin. Not all protest is wrong. And so these people are righteously indignant over the fact that, hey, how much more? And I know it's easy for us to say, well, he's been arrested, be patient, let the law do its course, because they already have this fear that somehow they'll dream up a way for this guy to walk. The other part of the fear that I have is that no matter what they do to this guy, even if he gets life in prison, anything short of a public hanging will not satisfy the mob mentality. But let's not get so caught up in our hatred of what's happening in our streets right now that we do not recognize and admit there is a genuine issue at hand here. A man is dead without jury, trial, evidence. He was just simply killed with his hands behind his back in what's called the submission position. At that point, those officers literally could have walked away and just stood there while they waited for the backup to come or whatever it was they were waiting for. But do not defend riotous, anarchist, communistic agitation which is causing the violence we see in the streets. People being just bystanders. One woman took a jog, wasn't anywhere near where the protesting was supposedly happening. Came back after her jog, and apparently a band of protesters had walked through the area, set fire to her car, and burned it right down to the hubcaps. How many police officers who just want to keep the streets safe for their own kids, for your kids, for the kids of George Floyd? He was a dad. And it wasn't about color for them. It was just about, let's keep the streets safe. How many of them now have been hurt or injured because they now have to deal with violent protesters, rioters? And we talk about Target and these businesses not going back into these neighborhoods. Do you think municipalities will send services back into those neighborhoods anytime soon? There's a young woman who I happen to pastor. She works on an ambulance. The night that the rioting broke out in the city of Toledo, every Toledo fire station went into lockdown. That means when those fires were lit, nobody responded. That means that even if in a neighborhood near there, if a legitimate emergency had arisen, a house fire, someone having a heart attack, an older person having a stroke, if people called 911, nothing was coming. Not a fire truck, not a paramedic, not an ambulance, nothing. When people cheer because police stations get burned to the ground and police cruisers get torched up and melted down to nothing but a pile of smoldering rubber and twisted metal, well, you do understand that all that's got to be replaced. And so millions and millions of tax dollars will now go to replace all of that. And you know what will happen to the minority neighborhoods and their underfunded schools and their underfunded programs? They will be even more underfunded because the funding they were getting will go to replace everything that was burnt to the ground and destroyed. And the people that stirred all this up initially, they don't care because a lot of them don't actually live there. They're an outside agitating force. So we need to, number one, again, acknowledge there was a crime, an injustice. Number two, do not link rioters and anarchists with legitimate protest. And number three, and some of you are going to say, "Oh, Pastor, save that for your pulpit." Pray. Prayer works. Prayer works. You need to pray.